Welcome to episode 15 of the Popanimecomics Lounge. My guest today is voice actor Greg Hauser. But before we get into the interview, I'd like to remind everybody, please follow me on Twitter at PopAnimeComics for all updates regarding this podcast and my website, popanimecomics.com, which you should check out because if you click on the affiliate links and purchase something from Amazon.com, I get a small commission at no cost to you, which helps keep this podcast up and running. So without further ado, let's dive right into this interview. So how did you get into voice acting?
The joke I like to tell people, actually my wife likes to say it first, and it's probably very accurate, is that I have a face for radio. So that's how I got into it. Long story short, it's one of those things where I didn't get into it very quickly. Life just kind of led me there. I had some friends who were doing put together a studio and were doing some children's television shows. They needed somebody who could speak with a particular dialect for a character whose face you never actually get to see, but is on screen. And I basically dubbed over the original actor because I was the only person available at the time who could speak with that particular dialect. Later on, there was a CBS crime drama called Hack. That was back around 2000 through 2002. It ran for 3 seasons. And they was actually one of the first CBS shows that was filmed in high definition. I was brought in for some minor stuff, and it turned out I actually understood how the technology for the for the HD cameras worked. And at the time, the things looked like, they were about the size of anti-aircraft guns. So they were really technological monstrosities. But I actually knew how to maintain and keep them running. Because of that, the crew for the show made sure to keep me around, and as a little thank you, any opportunity they had to give me a little extra work, such as if a sportscaster who was doing an announcement for something that was going to be put on like a TV in the background for the show, if they couldn't get somebody or they just needed something quick, they'd have me go over. They'd tell me what the scene was. I'd go with the sound guy, head over to a quiet area, or come into a booth and record that for them. And after a while, somebody was like, you're actually kind of good at this. Basically, they convinced me to continue following it. Kind of led me to where I am today.
So did you have any professional voice training or coaching?
I've studied voice. I've studied vocals for well over 15 years, probably closer to 20 now. I do sing. I actually sing quite often. So in that regard, yes. As an actor, I've worked with Walnut Street Theater. I've worked with folks like Bob Bergen, Pat Fraley. I've worked with a lot of the coaching talent located in my hometown of Philadelphia. But additionally, I also trained at studios and in theaters in New York, places such as the Upright Citizens Brigade, in particular the People's Improv Theater. I absolutely love that place. Worked with folks up in New York, such as Marla Curbin and folks along those lines to improve my acting chops, but also to learn more specific techniques for voiceover as well.
So obviously you also have a background in IT and engineering. Did that have any influence on you going into radio and voice acting and voiceover work?
I wouldn't say that it had an influence so much as it did have it allowed me to create a very unique niche for myself. And in that regard, if there was there is actually a lot of voiceover out there that is technical in nature. And most of it's handled by just a handful of people. And I'm one of them who's lucky enough to be able to get that work on a regular basis because of my background in the hard sciences. And I use that as my bread and butter as I both to build my name and my brand as an actor, but also to allow me to have something to serve as a base as I reached out into more commercial voiceover, or to try promo voiceover, or audiobooks, or even animation. It basically allowed me to have a solid base to fall back on.
So obviously you got your first job due to your friends. How did you get your second and third jobs?
The second and third job was really, I saw a casting notice and I just pounded pavement. And I just kept knocking on doors. I wish I could give you a more glamorous story, but that's the truth of it. I used whatever work I had done to kind of basically you're only as good as you're only as good as your next booking. So whatever work I had done, I would use that to try to get my next booking.
You also worked and did voiceover work for the NBA and Penn State. How did you get these jobs?
Casting agencies, quite frankly. Penn State, I'll admit I had a bit of an in at Penn State, and that in was nothing more than the fact that I am a Penn State alumni. And I don't even think they realized that until after I had recorded. But I paid attention to what the local casting notices were for the major markets that were near me, which in my case would be New York, New York, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Orlando, Tampa, basically the East Coast. So, those, Boston, and I would pay attention to a lot of the open casting notices. And by open, I mean stuff that people were putting online. If it was something that I thought I was a good fit for, I'd send my info in. My first year trying to do this professionally, maybe I had 5 or 6 paid bookings for probably close to 200 auditions, which is a horrible, horrible rate of return, at least in my mind. But I found out that for most people who were starting out as professionals, that was about normal. And based on the success of the work I had done, I was able to use that to build up, additional work and put together a pretty decent reel, which within the voiceover community, that's basically, that's your CV and your business card kind of wrapped up into one.
So what does a typical audition look like for a voice actor?
Well, it depends upon the type of voiceover work you're doing. For commercial in particular, you're lucky if they give you the copy, or they call it the copy, but it's basically a script. You're lucky if they give it to you ahead of time. More often than not, it's given to you at the time you show up for the audition, and you'll be given, if you're lucky, maybe a few minutes. There have been several times where I've shown up. I showed up early, and they didn't hand it to me until I was in the booth. I got maybe 30 seconds with it, and basically you perform. One of the big things for me was my improv background, being able to identify specifics out of a piece of copy, make commitments based on those specific items that I spotted within the copy, and learn to tell a good story. That's, quite frankly, in my opinion, that's what gets me cast when I have to audition for commercial work. For audiobooks, you're basically reading a couple of pages. It could be anywhere from, a minute at the short side to 3 or 4 minutes for your audition for a particular book. And in that part, you have to be not just a storyteller, but you need to basically be a storyteller while also trying to channel the spirit of what the author's trying to say. So it's a little different, but there are similarities. For corporate narration and things like that, it really comes down to you have to sound like a real person, and you have to have good pronunciation. If you can do those two things, industrial narration becomes a lot easier for you. For animation, you have to be able to lose yourself in the character. You have to be able to build the entire scene around you. Now, all of these things kind of lend to each other. Like, I can take a little bit of what I'm talking about for animation and put it into an industrial narration or an audiobook. But these are the things I think, that I try to focus on when I'm dealing with those specific types of voiceover. But each one's a little different, both in how the audition process works and also how the clients normally approach you. Like for a video game audition, I may be given I'll be sent an email with copy and I get a week to record it. Auditions are due at the end of the week. For a commercial, if my agent sends me a commercial copy for an audition, if I'm lucky, I get till the end of the day. If I go to a studio to audition, I'm lucky if I get 2 minutes.
So out of all these different, auditions, jobs, what do you find to be the easiest? What do you find to be the hardest? Or are they all present different challenges?
They all present different challenges, in my opinion. It's kind of like asking which one's the most fun. My answer is yes. I just have a blast being in the booth and being able to record. It's a very freeing experience for me. And from my background, I do not come from a family of entertainers. I come from a family of doctors and scientists and engineers. My brother and I were the disappointments of our family because I went into the IT and engineering world, and my brother became an MBA. So for us, that's the kind of family that I come from. Also, I like to joke that we've turned overachievement into an art form within my family, because the majority of my family is actually very intelligent and they're very accomplished in their fields. And I'm very lucky in that regard. Because of that very structured, rigid environment, acting did not come easily to me. For any type of acting, whether it's stage acting, voice acting, acting for film, it was very tough for me to learn to trust my instincts and to just allow myself to break out of that shell, so to speak. So for each and every aspect of voiceover, for me, there is some difficulty that I am constantly trying to improve myself upon.
Now, you have a studio, the Martini Lounge. How did you go about creating that?
This is one of those, this kind of goes back to your earlier question about how that scientific background helped me. Part of my education involved, the science of sound and acoustics. I was able to work with a few people who are extremely, extremely talented in that field. Together, we sat down and I told them what my plan was, which was I wanted to build a recording studio at my house, but I didn't want it to be simply me talking, doing voiceover in a walk-in closet or having a whisper room. I've done voiceover that way. There's nothing wrong with it. I just wanted something a little bit different. I wanted something a little bit more modular because I also play piano. I like to do other things. And to be fair, I wanted something where I could have a more natural sound. And the end result was we basically destroyed the top floor of my house and turned it into its own sound stage. But my background in acoustical engineering, guys like Brian Pape and Fran Manzella, their input, their advice, and their help, that's pretty much how we built it. From there, it just came down to racking and stacking the gear. And from that perspective, if you've got a good room, the gear becomes, it's still important, but the room is definitely the most important in my opinion as far as any recording studio goes.
And at your studio, what type of equipment do you have?
Okay, I was gonna say, because if people are listening to this and they're just trying to get into it, or if they're hobbyists, or even new to the industry, when people see my equipment or they come to the studio or they hear a list of mine, it has the tendency to kind of overwhelm them. I'll be flat out honest about it. You don't have to have what I have. I joke about it that it's a sickness, and I'm now on a 12-step program. I have a pair of vintage 610 preamps with new old stock RCA and Mullard tubes in them. For folks who don't know what the 610 preamps are, those are the ones that were a good example of those would be those were the preamps that were used for the Beatles' Abbey Road album. A pair of recovered Neve and recovered Ward Beck console units. Basically took the channels out and rack mounted them, which I like the sounds out of both of those. Got a couple Elemento pre's, which are made by Little Labs. They're a bit eclectic. You really have to know audio in order to use them well, but I love them. And then I've got literally a 400. I think it originally retailed for $400. It was a PreSonus MP20. It just sounds good. And it's proof positive that you don't have to spend tens of thousands of dollars to get a good sound. As far as the microphones I use, if I'm traveling, I'll use a 416, Sennheiser 416. It's just really good at dealing with rooms that aren't, well put together, like a hotel room. In my own studio, I like to use a U87 or a Horch. The Horch is kind of it's an eclectic choice. They don't make many of them, and they're rather expensive, but it's one of the most versatile mics if you know how to use them. And then, of course, I've just got microphones lying around doing all either for show or stuff that I use for eclectic purposes or that I rent out to other studios.
Do you have a favorite piece of equipment?
I couldn't narrow it down to one, but I have a couple of really choice pieces. One is it's an RCA 74B. It's a junior velocity ribbon microphone. The history behind the microphone is just absolutely astounding. It started off at Disney. It eventually found its way into a radio station in Milwaukee, and the engineer who, basically when they retired it, who took it off their hands, kept it around and used it for a lot of very neat projects and recordings. And as he got older, eventually he wanted to get rid of it, and it found its way into my collection. One of the reasons I like that microphone so much, and the reason I'm mentioning it is it's one of those microphones that I can actually open up. I can open up a file cabinet in my studio, pull out a file, and basically show you pictures of that microphone starting from when it was built in 1936 all the way up to present day. The microphone, when I received it, I had to do a little bit of work to tweak it. The ribbon was a little worn after, like 80 years, you would expect it to be. But thing still works like a champ, and I actually have a lot of microphones like that. One of the things I pride myself on is the microphones I keep in my house in particular. I try to keep a very detailed history on them.
So as a voice actor, what is the most important element to your studio?
The source. You can have the best equipment in the world, and if you're recording someone who sucks, it's going to suck. Even if you can get them to not suck, and this is where I always tip my hat to the recording engineers and the ADR directors and the commercial voiceover directors. The directors, and in particular the recording engineers, are the reason the voice actors sound awesome. And we do a great job, going in. If we're good, they make us sound even better. If we're having a bad day, they still make us sound good. But there is a limit. So if you have someone who just absolutely doesn't understand it, can't perform in front of a microphone, if you're recording, a singer, a saxophonist, a bass player, a piano player, basically anytime the source material is no good, you're not going to really get a good recording. And it's just going to be a lot of work and a lot of frustration. For me, I'd say the source is the most important, and a close second would be the environment. Because if you have a bad room, it doesn't matter how good the gear is, you're going to have issues. Whereas, I can take $100 microphone in my studio, $100 USB preamp interface, and it'll kick butt. It'll sound awesome because the environment's, it's a good recording environment.
So for your studio, do you have a philosophy that you pride yourself on?
2 drink minimum. The 11 o'clock show is completely different from the 7 o'clock, and always make sure to tip your waitress.
And obviously, in the voice acting world, software plays a big part. How do you keep up with the latest software that's out there?
Well, it depends. I don't actually subscribe to that philosophy quite so much. That's actually kind of the philosophy when you asked me, just a second ago about philosophy that I have for the Martini Lounge. I hear people use the phrase state of the art all the time. I'm sorry, but more often than not, when people say that, it's anything but. And not only that, but it doesn't have to be state of the art to sound good. Figure out what works for you and keep that in your bag of tricks, and then keep going. I have stuff I have microphones that are over 100 years old. They work. I like them. I have preamps that are getting close to 80 years old. They still work. I love them. And I have some stuff that's, brand new. I have stuff from Crane Song, and, I've got Little Freaks, and I've got stuff that's, they're still selling today. You can buy them for a couple of grand today. For me, it just comes down to use what works. Figure out what works for you, figure out what works for your style, and utilize that.
Now, to turn to something completely away from the technical aspects, but focus more on your anime voice work.
Oh, this will be a short conversation.
How did you discover anime before we dive into that entire conversation?
All right. I've got to blame my father for this one. The first movie I ever saw was Star Wars. I was like 4 or 5. Yeah, it came out in 78. And of course, in the original Star Wars film, you get your first peek at a lightsaber. You get to see, laser guns, the blasters, all that. Well, around that time comes a little show called Mobile Suit Gundam. And I got introduced to it. And now I see giant robots with blasters and beam sabers, which to my 5-year-old brain translates to laser gun and lightsaber. So I've got basically lightsabers, giant robots, big explosions. What else is there for a child, for a kid in the 70s? Not, is there anything else that's better to a kid in that, in that time frame? And that was my gateway anime.
So obviously, sometime later, when did you get the opportunity to get your first voice acting role in an anime?
Well, way, way, way back in the 90s is when fan dubs first started coming around. I know a lot of professionals, kind of, like they'll twitch their eye and, give you a funny look when you talk about those. That, my philosophy on that was, at the time it was legal. There were no laws in the books, really, up until the 1997 Net Act. You could do that. You could do that stuff. Fan subbing, fan dubbing, the distribution of such. As long as there was no money, that was perfectly legal. And internet was just starting to come around in 91, 92, 93. These communities started to form, and I found myself in a couple of them. I know one of my first big roles was a fan dub for Dragon Ball Z. Absolutely loved it. Had a blast. And for me, I've always just been a huge fan. So from a professional perspective, the amount of anime work I've done is small. Both the characters and just the number of titles. And I'll be the first to admit it. On the flip side, I'm a fan, so I'm just like, look, I could die tomorrow and I'd die a happy man, because as a fan, I got to help. I got to help. Make that. I got to help be a part of that. And that, to me, that's the coolest thing ever.
Now, when you recorded your small parts, did you do it in a studio, or did you do it in your studio, or how did you go about recording it?
We're talking fan dubs, right?
Fan dubs and professional.
For fan dubs, and before I started doing work professionally, really it was a microphone that was just put into a Turtle Beach sound card. I was doing that using Gold Wave. I know a lot of folks out there, use Gold Wave. I know a lot of them use Audacity. Audacity I was never really a huge fan of it. It's not a bad application. It just didn't trip my trigger. So Gold Wave, for me, and Gold Wave was cheap, so that was fine. As I progressed, now the one advantage I had was that I understood how the physics and science behind acoustics, so I was able to cobble stuff together so that it sounded better than my environment really should have sounded. Doing things like taking a collapsible storage box from Target, lining it with good acoustical foam, and putting a front address or a side address microphone in there, so that I didn't have to deal with as much of the room noise or the sound of the fan from the computer or any of that stuff. That's kind of how I got started, and that's one of the reasons why I know, especially when I would do like a fan dub or little stuff online, or even when I first started doing little stuff professionally or doing auditions, quality of my audio was good, and that's what kind of got it. But as I moved on, the technology was changing. Things like Cool Edit came out, which eventually became Adobe Audition. I learned to really enjoy that. And as my clients' needs changed, I had to change what I was doing and what I was using based on that, which eventually landed me into Pro Tools and Reaper.
So do you have any advice for anybody who wants to get into the voice acting community and the anime voice acting world and industry?
My first advice is to be an actor first. It's called voice acting for a reason, and you'll hear it said almost in any convention or any interview. If you can be a good actor, you can be taught mic technique, and you can learn to perform in a booth. You may not be as good as some other people. There may be a longer learning curve for it. That's fine. But if you know how to act, you can build upon that. If you have a background in music, whether you play an instrument, whether you sing, preferably both, those are things that you will very quickly learn as a voice actor. They give you an advantage. They really do. Both because you're able to identify rhythm and patterns within a script, but also particularly for singers, they're going to have better control over their vocal instrument. So from that standpoint, there's my advice. As far as the rest goes, I run into people all the time who go, I want to be an anime voice actor. That's great. Why are you limiting yourself? Work on being an actor first. And if you want to be a professional, great. Be a working professional. Once you're a working professional, you want to focus on anime, or you want to focus on a particular facet of acting? Absolutely. Why? Because if that doesn't work out for you, you've got all this other stuff you can fall back on. And you already come into it with this great body of work. One of my first mentors told me, from a voiceover perspective, love the words. Just learn to love the words. And this was a guy who was bigger than life. One of the first people who tried to help mentor me was Don LaFontaine. The guy, he was, for those who don't know him, he was the movie trailer guy. He was Mr. In a World. The man was truly bigger than life, and he brought all that personality, all that love, all that energy into every read he did. And that's why the go-to guy for like 30 years when it came to movie trailers. I could go on with advice for hours. I work with a couple of folks, Bill Rogers, occasionally Mark Swint. And I apologize for the plug. We do a workshop, and we actually talk about a lot of this stuff there, because like a 35-40 minute interview, I could have taken that whole time just to pass on advice and stuff that I've learned, on how to be a voice actor. And I'm just going to close my advice column with this. 95% of being a voice actor, of being just an actor, is just getting on stage. I mean, and what I mean by that is getting on stage and exposing yourself, getting in the booth and exposing yourself to the audience, to a director, to a casting agent. That's hard. But if you can just get in that booth, if you can just get on that stage, guess what? The hard part's over. Now you just got to perform. And it's once we learn to get outside of ourselves, once we learn to give up all those, to get out of our head, to break away from, those little fears and, little neuroses that we all have, that's when you see people truly become who they are. And that's when you see people perform at their best. And if you take a look at the guys right now who are at the top of the game for voiceover, folks like Rob Paulson, Bob Bergen, Frank Welker, all same as in for the anime folk, Jai Young Bosch, Mike McFarlane, Greg and Chris Ayers, all those guys. If you get to see Todd Haberkorn, all of them, and I could go on and on and on. You see them in the booth. You see the fact that all of those. There's always a part of them to all of those characters, but all of those little fears and neuroses or whatever that they may have, they left those at the door, because they're there, and they're just there. They're there to perform. They're there to have fun.
So do you have any promos, Facebook, Twitter, website?
For folks who are looking for me, if I owe you money, no. For everybody else, I do have a website. It's gregoryhauser.com. You can find me on Twitter at ghauser, and I'm on Facebook.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's podcast. As always, subscribe to this podcast where you get your podcasts so that it finds you and you don't find it. And as always, have a great week, everybody.